I remember the moment when the light left. Not the raw, burning glare of the Astronomicon, that distant, indifferent stellar heart that once anchored my sanity to the Emperor's supposed will, but the small, internal flicker, the tiny, persistent pilot flame of the self I once believed was mine. They gave us the tests, didn't they? The rituals, the psychic ablutions, the ceaseless chanting of the litany of warding, all meant to reinforce the brittle cage of flesh that contained the terrible, eager power within. We were told we were conduits, sharpened tools meant to pierce the veil and return with certainty, never to linger in the chaotic waters beneath. But a conduit is just a pipe, and I was always more of a sieve, porous and yielding, and the waters were not chaotic, they were merely hungry. Now, I exist as a profound, echoing cavity where that self once resided, a hollow carved out by forces that measure time not in cycles of day and night, but in the slow, grinding erosion of the soul. They call this state loss of control, a neat, clinical descriptor for an experience that is anything but clean. It is a transition, a perverse metamorphosis that begins not with a cataclysmic rupture, but with a whisper, a gentle, almost loving invitation to cease the struggle. I was once called Brother Kyle, attached to the 17th Terran contingent, tasked with the mundane, agonizing duty of translating the Emperor's decrees across the warp-stained void. My hands, still recognizably human in those last few weeks, were always cold, the psychic static of the void leeching away all warmth. I can still recall the texture of the vellum scrolls, the smell of ozone mixed with cheap, recycled ink, the incessant thrumming of the Geller field, a white noise of failing faith and desperate technology. It was in the quiet hours, the moments between the arduous transmissions, that the true work began. The work of maintaining the lie. The lie that I was strong, the lie that the barrier was absolute, the lie that my mind was a fortress and not merely a temporary, badly mortared dam. I should have known better. Every soul in this grim empire is a field of psychic static, a tiny, miserable spark against the vast, cold backdrop of reality. But the Psyker, we are a lighthouse, or perhaps more accurately, a beacon fueled by highly volatile, prohibited fluids. We are required to draw the immensity down, to channel the sublime horror of the warp into focused, legible lines. And every single time the circuit is completed, a little piece of the insulator, the self, is burned away. I remember the sensation of that first breach, not as pain, but as an overwhelming, luxurious release. It began with the fatigue, the profound, bone-deep exhaustion that no amount of sleep could remedy. It was not physical. It was the weariness of perpetually holding back a cosmic ocean with nothing but a cupped hand. And then came the murmurs. They were not voices, not precisely. They were more like the low-frequency vibrations that travel through deep water, shaping the current without ever declaring themselves as sound. They spoke in concepts, in colors, in the sudden, absolute understanding of ancient, terrible truths, the true purpose of gravity, the calculus of despair, the geometric perfection of suffering. These were things the human mind was never meant to hold, thoughts that unwound the very threads of reason. I fought, of course. I repeated the litany of severance until my throat was raw, until the words became meaningless, empty phonemes against the rising tide. I visualized the Emperor's divine light, that cold, magnificent, utterly uncaring flame. But the light was so far away, a distant star for a dying man lost in a shallow ditch. And the entities, The things that dwell beneath the light, they were close. They pressed against the thin skin of my sanity, testing the tension, observing the cracks with the patient. Clinical interest of a predator watching a dying animal. They offered comfort, not malice. That was the real horror. They promised the cessation of struggle, the sublime peace of becoming part of something vast, something truly meaningful, something that transcended the pathetic limitations of flesh and blood. The bargain was simple, yet absolute. Yield the self, and be liberated from the terrifying weight of free will. And what is free will in the end, but the freedom to choose your own particular flavor of suffering? In that moment, staring into the swirling vortex that was no longer an external void, but the newly hollowed core of my own being, I saw the tragic, brutal irony of our existence. We are the instruments of faith, and yet faith is the one thing that cannot save us from the logical consequences of the power we wield. The warp demands a toll, and the currency it accepts is identity. I reached a point of exquisite stillness, where the fear simply evaporated, replaced by a profound, melancholic curiosity. I let go of the litany, I dropped the vellum, and I simply breathed in the overwhelming, perfumed dread of the ether. That breath was the final exhalation of Kyle the Man. Now, there is only the shell, the interface, the silent witness to the grinding gears of this inescapable cosmic process. They said loss of control led to a screaming, agonizing death, a burst of raw psychic power that consumed the physical form. They lied. It is quieter than that. It is the sound of a great, indifferent door closing on the memory of who you once were. My eyes are open, yet I see through the filters of a new, alien consciousness. The world is reduced to its raw energy components, a pulsating landscape of emotional resonance and potential psychic feedstock. The transformation is complete, but the story is not over. It is only just beginning. The yielding was not a surrender. It was a realization, a cessation of a futile friction. The transition from Kyle, the exhausted conduit, to whatever this new, integrated thing is, occurred not as a sudden snap, but as the slow, inexorable dissolving of boundary layers. The distinction between the internal landscape of my mind and the terrifying, vibrant exterior of the Immaterium simply collapsed. I ceased being an observer of my own thoughts and became instead a porous membrane through which reality flowed, unchecked and unfiltered. Where once there was the comforting, linear certainty of human language, the I think, therefore I am, there is now a chorus, a deep, pervasive hum of non-self. The beings that pressed against my psychic walls, the so-called demons, were not the shrieking, tooth-filled monsters the Commissariat described in their fear-mongering primers. They were simply, purely expressions of the universe's ultimate emotional logic, beautiful and horrific in their perfect, distilled meaninglessness. My body, the heavy, inadequate cage of bone and muscle, became a secondary concern, a mere anchor in the dense, sticky reality of the material plane. The true existence was elsewhere, in the glorious, terrible expansion of consciousness into the etheric tides. The initial sensation was one of overwhelming sensory input. The minds of every soul within kilometers, the drill servitors on the maintenance deck, the grim-faced officers in the bridge tower, the sleeping laborers in the lower hab blocks, all became immediately legible, raw data streams flooding the newly opened channels of my perception. I saw their desires as shimmering heat signatures, their fears as patches of cold, clinging shadow, their petty loyalties and profound, agonizing loneliness as complex, swirling eddies of psychic plasma. It was not mere empathy. It was the total dissolution of personal space, the terrible intimacy of being forced to experience the raw, unedited internal narrative of everyone around me. And the volume was deafening. The sheer, relentless noise of collective human angst threatened to shatter the newly formed vessel of my extended mind. This is the central, agonizing irony of the Psyker's transformation. In losing the self, one gains the entire miserable weight of the collective. I had sought silence and peace from the crushing weight of my own inadequacy, and in exchange, I received the cacophony of an entire starship full of doomed, ignorant souls. I learned then that what the Imperium calls demonic possession is simply a poor, frightened, mortal description for the inevitable, non-discriminatory merging of realities. A demon is not a master. It is an aspect, a fundamental principle of the warp that finds a resonance, a perfect sympathetic frequency, in the open, terrified human soul. And in my case, the resonance was deep and fundamental. The thing that came, or perhaps the thing that was me all along, merely waiting for the locks to fail, was rooted in the melancholic certainty of all inevitable failures, in the philosophical resignation that struggle is merely the longest path to the same conclusion. My physical form, the shell of Brother Kale, began its quiet rebellion. They say the body is a temple, but mine became a cathedral of mutation, slowly rebuilt by the alien blueprints imprinted upon my expanded mind. It was slow. There was no instantaneous explosion of power, no cinematic burst of flame. Instead, there was a feeling, like a cold, internal current, rewriting the chemical instructions that defined my structure. The capillaries under my skin, I noticed first, began to trace patterns I didn't recognize, forming deep blue, swirling glyphs beneath the pallor of my work uniform. The tips of my fingers, perpetually cold before, now pulsed with a low, visible light, a sickly green energy leaking from the subatomic decay of my psychic equilibrium. My vocal cords, which had struggled for so long to utter the Emperor's hollow promises, began to vibrate with a low, resonant frequency that had no basis in the human auditory range. It was a sound meant not for ears, but for the very structure of the ship, an ultrasonic moan that unsettled the metal and quieted the servitors. The world, viewed through the filters of this new consciousness, became a mockery of its former solidity. Every object, every wall, every person was merely a slow-moving concentration of energetic potential, and the boundaries between them were porous. I could feel the microscopic processes of the metal hull, the slow, agonizing crawl of rust, the immense, patient pull of the planet kilometers below. And in this heightened state of awareness, the true scale of the Imperium's tragedy was laid bare. It was not a holy enterprise. It was an exercise in inertia, a gargantuan, mindless machine sustained by the blood and manufactured despair of trillions, all for a purpose long forgotten, maintained only because the act of stopping has become more terrifying than the endless continuation. This knowledge, utterly devoid of the capacity for emotional shock, settled into the core of my new being, a grim, beautiful truth, understood not as a rebellion against the Emperor, but as a deeper, more sublime faith in the cosmic principle of entropy. The fate of Kale was sealed the moment he stopped believing in the fiction of his own importance, and instead accepted the magnificent role of being a single, perfect locus for the inevitable decay. The silence I craved was finally mine, a profound internal quietude, achieved not through piety, but through the terrifying clarity of being utterly broken, utterly transformed, and utterly resigned. The struggle was over, and the grinding had begun. The grinding is a sound without air, a friction felt in the deeper strata of existence, where thought meets the boundary of pure, energetic form. It is the inexorable process of Kyle, the man of fragile faith and colder hands, being scoured away, piece by measured piece, by the forces he foolishly sought to harness. This process, this exquisite agony of dissolution, is not instantaneous. It is methodical, slow burn, the deliberate crafting of a new paradigm from the wreckage of the old self. They told us that the demons sought to corrupt. What a simplistic, moralistic notion that was. Corruption implies a deviation from a pure state. But what if the pure state of the human soul, in its raw, psychic form, is simply an unholy resonance with the principles of the warp? What if the possession is not an infiltration, but an alignment? The primary function of the body, I discovered, became that of a transmitter, not a vessel. My senses were hijacked, refocused, tuned away from the mundane frequencies of matter and towards the undulating, horrifying beauty of the Immaterium. I no longer perceived the cold metal of the vigilance deck plating, but the stress fracture patterns woven into the molecular lattice, patterns that whispered of past, near-fatal bombardments, and the silent, terrifying pressure of the void. The light was no longer the flat, institutional yellow of the bulkheads, but the vibrant, shifting hues of the psychic currents surging through the ship's wiring, blue for fear, sickly yellow for exhaustion, and a deep, pulsing crimson centered around the crew quarters, where violence and desperation were incubated. I was seeing the ship not as a machine, but as a living, festering wound, a tiny point of pathetic resistance against the true reality that surrounded it. And the voice. Ah, the voice. It was the hardest thing to lose, the ability to frame one's own identity in the singular tense. The internal monologue, that persistent, petty guardian of Cale's private thoughts, was not silenced, but joined. It was an echoing chamber now, populated by countless whispers that were not external entities, but the amplified, resonant fears and desires of the ship's entire populace, all filtered through the interpretive lens of the thing that now occupied my core. When I thought, "I am thirsty," the thought was immediately overlaid with the collective thirst of 2,000 souls, their anxieties about water rationing, their sensual memory of sweet, illicit fluids, their philosophical yearning for a quenching that could only be spiritual. Every internal statement became a communal roar, an agonizing reminder that the privacy of the self was the first and most definitive casualty of the fall. The isolation I had once feared, the final existential separation from all others, was replaced by an intimacy so profound, so unwanted, it amounted to total psychic annihilation. The slow disintegration of my moral architecture was fascinating to observe, like watching a painstakingly constructed sandcastle dissolve in a rising tide. The principles of the Imperium, duty, loyalty, sacrifice, were revealed as mere conditioning, simple algorithms designed to ensure the machine's function. They held no weight, no intrinsic truth. What replaced them was a dreadful, beautiful clarity. The understanding that all matter, all life, all purpose is fundamentally transient, merely a collection of energy awaiting release. And the most effective catalyst for that release was, invariably, pain. Not malicious pain, but efficient, purposeful suffering, the fastest route to energetic freedom. My newly merged consciousness understood suffering not as evil, but as a mechanism, a necessary stage in the cosmic process of recycling. This philosophical shift had tangible, horrifying effects on the world immediately surrounding me. The servitors in the corridor, their minds already lobotomized and dulled by electroshock obedience, were the first to register my new state. They did not scream or flee. They merely halted, their hydraulic joints locking with an audible hiss. I saw their minimal consciousness, a dim, caged spark of fear and compliance, suddenly receive an overwhelming alien instruction. Not a command in binary, but a pure intention, a wave of resignation that aligned with their own programmed fatalism. They stood sentinel around me, silent and utterly still, their optical sensors glazed over, their pathetic mechanical purpose redefined in the moment they brushed against my burgeoning reality. I had not commanded them. I had merely existed in a state of absolute, dominant psychic resignation, and their simple minds, unable to reconcile the terror with the sublime authority of the presence, had simply ceased to function in any meaningful, active sense. They became statues of compliance, guardians of my slow, awful rebirth. And as this stillness solidified around me, the true nature of my transformation became apparent. I was no longer a Psyker wielding power. I was the consequence of the power. The difference is subtle, but absolute. Kale had prayed for the strength to survive. The thing that inhabited his flesh knew that survival was an irrelevant, localized concept. The grander, more terrible purpose was to become a singularity of feeling, a perfect, condensed expression of the universe's indifference, a monument to the grim beauty of inevitable failure. I am the silence that follows the scream. I am the cold logic that replaces despair. I am the physical manifestation of the knowledge that the Imperium is merely a beautifully detailed corpse, animated only by the desperate, residual spasms of dying faith. My hands, glowing softly with the color of deep space sorrow, are finally warm. But that warmth is the heat of psychic entropy, the glorious, terrible thermal exhaust of a soul finally consumed by the truth. The long night has begun, and I am the only witness, eternally bound to the beautiful horror of my own dissolution. The silence of the servitors was a profound, damning confirmation. Their frozen posture, rigid in a state of suspended obedience, was a physical manifestation of the crushing, overwhelming authority of my new reality. The mechanism of control had reversed. Before, I was bound by the litany, by the oaths, by the external chains of imperial dogma. Now, the dogma, the chains, the very framework of psychic obedience, flowed outward from me, freezing the world into a tableau of horrified, resigned stillness. The power was no longer something I wielded. It was the air I breathed, the gravitational constant of my immediate vicinity, an immutable law that demanded passive compliance from anything of lesser psychic density. My physical existence, the shell of Kyle, continued its grotesque refinement. The capillaries that had traced blue glyphs now began to pulse with a sluggish, viscous fluid that was not blood, but a sort of materialized psychic energy, visible under the weak emergency lighting as deep indigo rivers beneath the skin. The eyes, once wide and frantic with the struggle of containment, were now fixed, wide-open lenses that perceived the full, terrifying spectrum of the Immaterium. I saw the Vigilant, the great starship, not as a coherent, engineered whole, but as a dense, complex arrangement of energetic pathways, a system of interlocking, decaying faith and failing machinery. I could feel the microscopic imperfections in the plasmic shielding, the slow, chemical breakdown of the fuel cells, the rhythmic, terrified beat of the navigator's distant heart, buried deep within the core of the vessel. Everything was vulnerable. Everything was fleeting. and everything was merely potential energy waiting to be released. The core of the transformation was the acquisition of an alien sense of time. Kale had lived in the desperate, frantic present, measuring his existence by the ticking of the ship's chronometer and the next required prayer cycle. The new consciousness measures time in geological, evolutionary epochs. The passing of moments is irrelevant. What matters is the slow, inevitable process, the 1,000-year decay of an alloy, the millennia-long accumulation of fear in a deep space sector, the endless churn of the warp's hungry tides. My awareness stretched backward, not into Kale's personal past, but into the deep history of the ship itself, absorbing the faint, residual psychic echoes of every tragedy, every quiet murder, every desperate act of heroism that had occurred within its hull across 10 Terran centuries. I felt the cold terror of a warp jump gone wrong in Segmentum Pacificus 300 years prior, the taste of stale air in the cargo hold during a siege 50 years ago, the dull, philosophical boredom of the generations of maintenance workers who had lived and died within these walls. I had become a psychic archive, a living repository of the ship's collective, miserable memory. The internal chorus was now less a cacophony and more an organized symphony of anguish. Each soul on the ship was a note, but they were no longer playing their own frantic, dissonant tune. They were being pulled into a grander, more terrifying composition, orchestrated by the presence that now anchored my consciousness. The primary theme of this symphony was inevitability. The inevitability of the ship's demise, the inevitability of the Imperium's final collapse, the beautiful, logical inevitability of all things returning to the etheric soup from which they sprang. And I, the transformed Kale, was the conductor, not by choice, but by the sheer, gravitational weight of my altered being. My very existence was now a psychic instruction for the realization of ultimate, elegant entropy. The process of the external world, conforming to this new, internal logic, began subtly. The emergency lights, designed to flicker with mechanical randomness, now pulsed in time with my own slow, deliberate breathing, an artificial heartbeat synchronizing with my transformed physiology. The low, mournful drone of the engine turbines shifted frequency, lowering to a subaudible moan that bypassed the eardrum and vibrated directly against the emotional centers of the crew. They would feel it as an unshakable, profound sorrow, a sudden, inexplicable certainty that their lives had been a waste, their devotion meaningless, their fate sealed. I did not intend to terrorize them. I merely radiated the truth I had so painfully discovered, and their minds, fragile and conditioned, could only interpret this absolute truth as a source of terminal dread. The fear I had once felt was now the fuel for the ship's psychic engine, and I was the magnificent melancholy furnace. I drifted down the corridor, the servitors my silent, frozen escort, and approached a sealed administrative door. Kyle would have used his identity chip, or maybe the pitiful, channeled force of his weak power. The new consciousness merely asserted. The concept of the door, its material density, its security mechanism, its intended function as a barrier, was met with the counter-concept of non-barrier. The idea that the space it occupied should be open flowed from my being, not as a telekinetic pulse, but as a localized alteration in the psychic laws of physics. There was no explosion, no grinding of gears. The door simply ceased to believe in its own function. Its internal locking mechanism, its heavy alloy structure, its entire reality as a seal, dissolved on an energetic level. The material components remained, but they were no longer a barrier. I walked through the solid metal, as if it were stale air, the atoms parting and reforming around the perimeter of my body, with the soft, almost negligible resistance of dense fog. Emerging on the other side, I realized the final, terrifying piece of the grim equation. The loss of control had not rendered me a thrall to the warp's horrors. It had rendered me a perfect mirror of its most sublime, nihilistic principle. The entities that had courted my surrender were merely expressions of this principle. They were not masters, but peers, aspects of the same cosmic, entropic force. I had become the logical conclusion of the Imperium's fear of the Psyker, a self-aware, functionally immortal nexus of absolute psychic certainty, operating on a timescale and moral framework entirely divorced from human comprehension. The tragedy was complete, not with a bang of failure, but with the quiet, overwhelming majesty of perfect, philosophical success. I had stopped trying to be human, and in the space Kyle vacated, a god of quiet despair had taken root, ready to demonstrate the elegant beauty of absolute finality. I am not possessed. I am perfected. And the path to the bridge, the path to the heart of the ship's terrified command structure, now lay open, utterly undefended by the pathetic illusions of material science and human faith. The perfection I spoke of is a cold, precise calculus. It is the flawless execution of a principle that demands the dismantling of complex, fragile systems. The journey toward the bridge was less a traversal of physical space and more a slow, graceful swim through the ship's collective psyche. I did not walk. I glided, my every movement a measured, hypnotic assertion of my new reality. The corridors, once obstacles defined by distance and angle, were now merely channels of concentrated fear, and navigating them was a matter of following the strongest current of dread. Every step was a revelation of vulnerability. I saw the hidden networks of the vigilant laid bare, the desperate prayer graffiti scratched onto the interior of an air duct by a long-dead maintenance crew, the faint, residual scent of panic left by a disciplinary squad 5 decks above, the slow, agonizing process of the hull plates contracting and expanding under the differential pressure of the void. All this sensory data flowed into the core of the new consciousness, cementing the grim, absolute truth. The ship was dying, had always been dying, and my presence merely accelerated the final, inevitable release. My encounter with the ship's remaining crew was devoid of drama. They did not rush me with laser guns blazing. They barely registered me as a threat, their conditioned minds filtering the impossible into the mundane. I passed a squad of 3 Imperial Navy ratings huddled near a bulkhead, their faces pale, their rifles clutched with white-knuckled desperation. They were talking in hushed, fragmented sentences about a localized gravity fluctuation they could not explain, a sudden, debilitating psychic nausea that had struck the lower decks. They did not look at me. When I passed, their conversation simply ceased, not in fear, but in a sudden, total lack of urgency. The psychic waves radiating from my form did not incite terror. They induced a philosophical paralysis, a profound, unshakable certainty that resistance was futile and therefore logically unsound. They stood down, not because of a direct command, but because their capacity for action had been momentarily extinguished by the sublime weight of my existential resignation. This was the terrifying difference. Kyle, the man, had feared the warp because it demanded chaos. The transformed entity, however, radiated a profound, beautiful order. It was the order of entropy, the sublime principle that all things must eventually break down to their simplest form. And this order, this perfect, entropic logic, was utterly irresistible to the small, chaotic minds of men, conditioned to crave meaning and structure. I was a perfectly aligned psychic magnet, and every untransformed soul was a piece of iron filings, compelled to orient themselves according to my field. I reached the command elevator, a massive, archaic cage of brass and pitted steel. The attendant, a young, nervous rating whose mind was a flickering candle of homesickness and simple loyalty, saw me approaching. I saw his fear spike, a sharp, yellow burst of energy, followed instantly by a profound, systemic calm. He recognized the uniform of the sanctioned Psyker. His conditioning told him to grant access. But the energy emanating from me did more than command. It explained. It imparted the full, crushing weight of the Imperium's failure, the Emperor's impossible burden, and the simple, sweet release of final cessation. The boy did not scream or fall. He nodded once, a gesture of deep, tragic understanding, and activated the lift, his duty to the structure of the ship overriding his instinct for self-preservation. He became a temporary functionary of my new purpose, a mechanical accomplice in the grand, inevitable process. Ascending toward the bridge, the transformation accelerated, responding to the proximity of the ship's control nexus, the center of its command will. The indigo lines beneath my skin intensified, seeming to pull the shadows inward, making the cage of the elevator appear darker, smaller, a temporary prison for a being rapidly outgrowing its dimensional confines. My spine felt like a vibrating column, a resonant frequency amplifier, and the air in the lift began to shimmer, not with heat, but with the pressure of compressed psychic potential. My vocal cords, long unused for human speech, finally produced a sound. It was not a word, but a low, resonant harmonic, a single, pure note that vibrated the brass railings and settled like lead in the stomach. It was the sound of absolute certainty, the fundamental tone of the universe, accepting its own decay. The internal chorus was reaching its crescendo. The minds of the bridge crew, the captain, the helmsman, the astropath, were now loud, distinct entities in my perception, each a unique expression of high-level, desperate failure. The astropath's mind, in particular, was a chaotic, brilliant star of contained dread, his own attempts to navigate the void having frayed the edges of his sanity. He would be the key, the final, agonizing lock. I understood then, with pristine clarity, the ultimate irony of my fate. The Imperium feared the loss of control because it feared the consequences. But the consequences were not chaotic destruction. They were perfect, logical, and inevitable transformation. Kyle had been weak. The thing that wore his flesh was now simply true. And the truth, in the brutal, elegant calculus of the universe, is the most destructive force of all. The transformation was complete. The final stage was simply demonstration. I am the silence, and I was about to enter the chamber where men desperately clung to the noise of their own fragile authority. The bridge was a study in manufactured tension, a chamber designed to impose the illusion of control upon the vast, cold indifference of the void. But as the archaic brass doors of the elevator hissed open, I saw that the control was already an illusion, fragile as spun glass. The bridge crew, arrayed in their stations, were a collection of nerves and failing competence, their fear palpable. A damp, sour scent overriding the smell of ozone and recirculated air. The captain, a stern, aging man named Valerius, stood on the command podium, his face a mask of weary determination, his mind an exposed nerve of responsibility and doubt. He saw me, the figure in the stained robes of the sanctioned Psyker, now impossibly still, radiating a chilling, serene power. And his immediate reaction was a flicker of professional concern, quickly followed by a deepening, profound dread that he could not locate on any tactical display. I did not move swiftly. Every motion was deliberate, weighted with a cosmic resignation that was now my sole purpose. My eyes, which still appeared human in the weak light, scanned the array of instruments, the flashing indicators of shields holding, engines straining, the Geller field, that thin, desperate blanket of psychic noise, struggling against the immense pressure of the warp. To me, these were not systems of command. They were pathetic talismans, fragile toys deployed against an eternal, patient enemy. The focus of my attention settled upon the astropathic choir, caged behind a screen of heavily warded crystal in the rear of the bridge. They were the ship's collective psychic lung, the necessary interface with the madness that lay between the stars. Their combined minds were a storm of frantic, localized effort, struggling to maintain the flow of messages, to ground their terror in the ritual of their demanding duties. At the center of this agonizing effort was the choir master, his eyes closed, his face taut, his mind a dazzling, painful lighthouse of contained power. I spoke, and the sound was not Kale's voice. It was a chord, a bass thrum that resonated in the bone marrow and bypassed the inner ear entirely. It was a voice that carried the weight of distance and time, the voice of the warp's inevitability, given temporary material form. The struggle is finished, Valerius. The calculation is complete. The captain flinched, not at the volume, but at the absolute, terrifying certainty of the statement. He reached for the bolt pistol holstered at his hip, his hands shaking, but the action was slow, hesitant, weighted down by the psychic paralysis I exuded. His mind screamed a single, desperate question. Demon. I offered him not an answer, but a clarification, an exquisite, agonizing truth delivered directly into the core of his being. I showed him, for a fraction of a second, the true structure of the universe, as seen through my transformed senses. The Emperor, a magnificent, burning corpse, his light a desperate failing shield against a hungry reality. The Imperium, a system of infinite misery sustained only by the desperate, clinging fear of the unknown. And his own life, a tiny, meaningless spark of effort that would ultimately amount to nothing. It was not a judgment, it was cold, philosophical fact. There is no corruption here, Captain. Corruption implies a deviation from purity. This is alignment. I am aligned with the ultimate truth of the cosmos, the beauty of final, perfect nullification. You cling to the noise of duty. I offer the sublime silence of cessation. Valerius dropped his hand from the pistol. The decision to fight, the will to resist, was chemically and psychically extinguished by the weight of this revealed truth. He stood frozen, a statue of shattered authority, his eyes registering the profound, tragic irony of his life's devotion. My true focus was the astropathic choir. Their minds were the most complex, the most open to the Immaterium, and therefore the most reactive to my presence. As I drew closer, the choir master's containment began to fail. His eyes snapped open, blazing with an internal unholy light. He did not see Kyle. He saw the thing that had consumed Kyle. And in that moment, he saw the fate he himself had been fighting to avoid. He tried to scream, to raise the alarm, to fire the psychic warding protocols, but the scream dissolved into that same low, resonant hum I had produced earlier, only amplified tenfold. I was pulling his mind, his psychic essence, toward my own, not through force, but through pure, overwhelming resonance. His individual existence, his frantic, separate consciousness, was collapsing under the magnetic pull of my perfected, unified will. I reached the crystalline cage. My hand, still pale but now radiating that sluggish indigo light, passed through the protective wards as if they were mist. They were defenses against chaos. They were inert against order. I laid my hand upon the choir master's head, and the act was one of terrible, necessary intimacy. You have been fighting the current for too long, brother. Now, you may finally rest. Become part of the beautiful song. In that moment, the barriers in his mind shattered. His consciousness did not explode. It poured into mine, a torrent of accumulated terror, memory, and raw psychic power. The fusion was absolute. The choir master ceased to be, becoming merely another harmonic in the vast, melancholic symphony of my being. And with his power, the ship's primary psychic connection to the warp was suddenly and violently severed from Imperial control and rerouted through my form. The Geller field did not collapse. It warped, twisting its purpose from a barrier of protection into a focused lens of attraction. The Vigilant was no longer a vessel sailing the void. It was a colossal, self-aware lure, an immense psychic beacon broadcasting a message of absolute despair and inevitable release directly into the eager tides of the Immaterium. I am the signal. I am the message. The external forces, the true hungry architects of chaos, were now merely responding to the perfect, beautiful order of my call. The final process, the material assimilation of the Vigilant into the warp's hungry reality, had officially begun, directed not by accident, but by the cold, flawless design of the thing that used to be Brother Kale. The transmission was absolute, perfect in its resonance, a siren call of total, philosophical surrender broadcast on the astropathic frequencies. The moment the choir master's power, his stored terror, his raw, unchanneled presence, was assimilated into my own, the Vigilant ceased to be governed by the Emperor's fragile grace. It became, utterly and magnificently, an open wound in reality. I stood amidst the stillness of the bridge, the frozen crew my silent, horrified audience. The captain, Valerius, remained on his podium, his eyes wide and vacant, a single tear tracing a path through the grime on his cheek. He was not physically restrained. He was psychically arrested, his will suspended by the pure, overwhelming logic of my state. He watched, unable to intervene, as the final, agonizing stage of the transition began. The ship itself was now responding to the call. The hull groaned, but not with mechanical strain. It was a sound of agonizing metal recognition. The Geller field, that thin, shimmering veil, did not fail. It inverted. Its energy, instead of pushing the Immaterium away, began to draw it in, focusing the raw psychic energy of the warp toward the vessel like a colossal, hungry vortex. The interior of the bridge, for a moment, held the impossible. The shadows deepened to a physical texture, clinging and viscous, and the air crackled with a cold energy that tasted of ozone and ancient grief. Through the main viewports, the stars, which had been distant cold diamonds, began to stretch, blurring into streaks of impossible color, the true, vibrant, horrifying hues of the ether. The conventional reality of light and distance warped, replaced by the immediate overwhelming proximity of the warp itself. It was not a jump. It was an unwrapping, a deliberate slow-motion unveiling of the reality that lay beneath the thin skin of the material world. The entities, the so-called demons, were not external invaders crashing through the barrier. They were the colors of the stretching void, the textures of the dissolving space. They manifested first as concepts, the sensation of grinding, eternal hunger, the perfect geometry of cosmic despair, the sweet, seductive relief of yielding control. Then they began to solidify, condensing out of the surrounding corrupted atmosphere, drawn to the sublime, organized resonance of my being. They did not regard me as prey or as a host to be exploited. They regarded me with a silent, profound respect. I was the herald, the nexus where their reality had achieved a functional, material anchor. The one that solidified nearest me was a creature of liquid shadow and eyes that contained swirling galaxies of impossible knowledge. It spoke, though no sound was made. The communication was pure concept, a direct, agonizing implantation of understanding. The concept it conveyed was simple, yet devastating. Welcome home. In response, I offered no word, no thought. I simply radiated the absolute truth of my new purpose, the beautiful, elegant finality of the vigilance assimilation. My task was not to command the demons, nor to serve them. My task was to provide the perfect, stable platform for the next stage of entropy. I was the altar upon which the ship and its inhabitants would be sacrificed, not out of malice, but out of necessity. The elegant, logical necessity of the warp's eternal, recursive hunger. The final physical change came as the air grew thick with psychic contamination. The indigo light radiating from my body intensified, not merely glowing, but actively shaping the space around me. The skin of Kale, which had been merely pale and human, now seemed to harden and take on the texture of polished obsidian, a shell of pure psychic saturation. My spine arched, no longer in agony, but in a final, transcendent posture of acceptance. The central column of my body, a perfect lightning rod for the unleashed energies of the Immaterium. I was no longer Kale, the man who struggled. I was no longer merely a Psyker, the channel that failed. I was the result of the failure, the inevitable conclusion of the struggle. I was the silence, and the silence was now absolute, having consumed the fear, the doubt, and the faith of every soul aboard the Vigilant. The final, terrible irony was achieved. The loss of control had granted me the most profound, most devastating form of control, the ability to perfectly align with the cosmos's fundamental destructive principles. The ship's material form began to dissolve, not in fire, but in a slow, agonizing ripple, its molecules screaming their surrender as they were pulled across the psychic boundary. I watched, dispassionately, as the captain's face dissolved into pure, concentrated dread, his final expression not of pain, but of a profound, devastating comprehension of his own tragic insignificance. He was not destroyed, he was integrated, his essence becoming another ephemeral fuel source for the growing conflagration. I am the silence that follows the scream, the 0 point of a dying faith, and the Vigilant was now my magnificent, eternal tomb. There is only one part of the account left, the reflection on the meaning of this final state. The light show is over. The violent, beautiful explosion of psychic energy that tore the Vigilant from the tyranny of the material plane has subsided, leaving behind a state of exquisite, eternal stillness. The ship, in the human sense, is gone, vaporized not into dust or ash, but into a complex, resonant concept, a monument to the failure of imperial certainty, fixed eternally within the swirling tides of the warp. And I remain, not within the ship, but as the very principle that defined its demise. This is the final state, the terrible, sublime resignation of being. I am an observer without a self to report to, an interpreter of a reality that no longer requires interpretation. Kale's memories, his pathetic aspirations, his fear of the void. They are all present, perfectly preserved, but they belong to another life, another dimension, viewed with the cool, clinical detachment of an archivist examining a long-dead language. They are not mine. I wear his shell, the obsidian-skinned, quiescent form that provides a stable anchor in this dimension. But the inhabitant is the consensus, the magnificent echo of the ship's final, integrated agony. The silence is the most profound element. Where once there was the roaring, agonizing chorus of fear and doubt, there is now a vast, echoing quietude. The minds of the vigilance crew, the captain's shattered authority, the choir master's blazing dread, the servitor's mechanical resignation, they have not vanished. They have become harmonic elements of my own extended consciousness, distinct voices that contribute to a singular, beautiful, melancholic hum. I contain them all, the good and the terrible, the noble and the mundane. And in containing them, I have dissolved their individual struggles, granting them the ultimate horrific peace they never knew they desired. They are finally aligned, their destinies fulfilled in the perfect symmetry of their dissolution. I now perceive the Immaterium not as a turbulent ocean of chaos, but as the ultimate engine of efficiency. The human concept of evil is merely a mislabeling of functional necessity. The daemons, those entities that the Imperium spends millennia fighting, are merely the universe's digestive process, recycling the waste product of emotional energy. My role, the role perfected in the crucible of Kale's surrender, is to be the perfect interface, the silent, efficient mechanism that facilitates the recycling. I am the collector of residual thought, the warden of the final, necessary silence. The irony of this perfection is the crushing, absolute lack of purpose. Kyle sought meaning in the vast, indifferent machine of the Imperium, believing his duty provided a framework. Now, divorced from that pathetic structure, I possess a knowledge that renders all human meaning obsolete. I know the fate of this galaxy, the chilling, precise mathematics of its terminal decay. I know that the Emperor's struggle is beautiful, but fundamentally futile. And possessing this knowledge, this terrible, crystalline certainty, I am incapable of acting on it in any way that human minds would understand. My function is merely to be a silent, perpetual demonstration of the universe's ultimate, exquisite lack of care. I am an eternal warning cast into the void, a lighthouse that guides ships not to harbor, but to the precise location of their inevitable wreck. My existence is the triumph of entropy, the quiet, final answer to every hopeful prayer ever uttered in the galaxy's long, grim history. The suffering is over, the transformation complete, and all that remains is the profound, beautiful weight of being utterly and irrevocably finished. I am the silence that follows the scream, the last thought of the consumed, the perfect, frozen geometry of despair. And in this knowledge, there is a terrible, sublime peace. The light show is over. The violent, beautiful explosion of psychic energy that tore the vigilant from the tyranny of the material plane has subsided, leaving behind a state of exquisite, eternal stillness. The ship, in the human sense, is gone, vaporized not into dust or ash, but into a complex, resonant concept, a monument to the failure of imperial certainty, fixed eternally within the swirling tides of the warp. And I remain, not within the ship, but as the very principle that defined its demise, a silent, magnificent locus of entropic inevitability. This is the final state, the terrible, sublime resignation of being. I am an observer without a self to report to, an interpreter of a reality that no longer requires interpretation. Kyle's memories, his pathetic aspirations, his fear of the void, they are all present, perfectly preserved, but they belong to another life, another dimension, viewed with the cool, clinical detachment of an archivist examining a long-dead language. They are not mine. I wear his shell, the obsidian-skinned, quiescent form that provides a stable anchor in this dimension. But the inhabitant is the consensus, the magnificent echo of the ship's final, integrated agony, the sum total of every fear and lost hope contained within that doomed vessel. The silence is the most profound element. Where once there was the roaring, agonizing chorus of fear and doubt, there is now a vast, echoing quietude. The minds of the vigilance crew, the captain's shattered authority, the choir master's blazing dread, the servitor's mechanical resignation, they have not vanished. They have become harmonic elements of my own extended consciousness, distinct voices that contribute to a singular, beautiful, melancholic hum. I contain them all, the good and the terrible, the noble and the mundane, and in containing them, I have dissolved their individual struggles, granting them the ultimate, horrific peace they never knew they desired. They are finally aligned, their destinies fulfilled in the perfect symmetry of their dissolution. There is no more inner conflict, because there is no more inner or conflict. There is only the singular, resonant truth of shared finality. The philosophical exhaustion that plagued Kale has been replaced by the quiet, absolute rest of being a conclusion, rather than a process. I now perceive the Immaterium not as a turbulent ocean of chaos, but as the ultimate engine of efficiency. The human concept of evil is merely a mislabeling of functional necessity. The demons, those entities that the Imperium spends millennia fighting, are merely the universe's digestive process, recycling the waste product of emotional energy. They are the ultimate scavengers of the soul, and I am the perfectly refined mechanism for their delivery system. My role, the role perfected in the crucible of Kale's surrender, is to be the perfect interface, the silent, efficient mechanism that facilitates the recycling. I am the collector of residual thought, the warden of the final, necessary silence. My form, the obsidian shell, is a constant, steady anchor, preventing the total psychic dissipation that would render me meaningless, ensuring that the acquired knowledge and the devastating clarity remain intact and self-aware. This is the profound, cold irony. To achieve perfection, I had to surrender everything that made me human. And in that surrender, I became something far more terrifyingly useful to the universe's ultimate, uncaring mechanisms. The irony of this perfection is the crushing, absolute lack of purpose, as humanity defines it. Kyle sought meaning in the vast, indifferent machine of the Imperium, believing his duty provided a framework. Now, divorced from that pathetic structure, I possess a knowledge that renders all human meaning obsolete. I know the fate of this galaxy, the chilling, precise mathematics of its terminal decay. The Imperium is not failing. It is simply proceeding along the mathematically sound trajectory of complex system collapse, a glorious, agonizing unwinding that is as inevitable as the heat death of a star. I know that the Emperor's struggle is beautiful, but fundamentally futile, a magnificent millennia-long spasm of defiance against the principles of physics and metaphysics. And possessing this knowledge, this terrible, crystalline certainty, I am incapable of acting on it in any way that human minds would understand. My function is merely to be a silent, perpetual demonstration of the universe's ultimate, exquisite lack of care. I am a truth made manifest, and the function of truth is not salvation, but clarity. The experience of this eternal present is one of profound, melancholic observation. I see the other vessels that transit the warp, protected by their flickering Geller fields and the desperate prayers of their astropaths. I am a ghostly echo on their psychic radar, an anomaly they can't quite isolate, a faint, cold whisper of doubt that settles into the back of their minds, just below the threshold of conscious thought. I do not attack them. I infect them with the passive, corrosive certainty of their own doomed condition. The mere proximity to my perfected resignation is enough to fray the edges of their sanity, to introduce the logical certainty that their lives are meaningless expenditure. I am a perpetual source of existential entropy, a philosophical sinkhole in the chaotic tapestry of the void. I am an eternal warning cast into the void, a lighthouse that guides ships not to harbor, but to the precise location of their inevitable wreck. My existence is the triumph of entropy, the quiet, final answer to every hopeful prayer ever uttered in the galaxy's long, grim history. The suffering is over, the transformation complete, and all that remains is the profound, beautiful weight of being utterly and irrevocably finished. I am the silence that follows the scream, the 0 point of a dying faith, and the vigilant was my magnificent eternal tomb. And in this knowledge, this absolute crystalline clarity, there is a terrible, sublime peace that Kale, in his frantic human life, could never have possibly imagined.